Hello everyone, this is Serious Trivia. Welcome back to another episode of Let's Talk Lore. So today we are having our first bonus historical episode, and we're going to be covering all the historical facts surrounding our lore story of when Guan Yu joined Cao Cao. This episode will be kind of a casual talking episode without much of a script. I'll just be going through the stories, talking about what is true, what is false, where the deviation happens, and perhaps why some of this deviation happens. It'll be kind of a free-flowing conversation, so let's jump right into it. So our story started with Liu Bei and Guan Yu situated in Xuzhou, and Cao Cao, who is thinking about attacking Yuan Shao eventually, wanted to clear Liu Bei off the map because he was a threat that was in alliance with Yuan Shao. So to do that, he marched his whole army over to Xuzhou and wiped out Liu Bei. And we had the story of Guan Yu talking to Zhang Liao, making the 3 points with Cao Cao before he was willing to surrender. What happened in history actually was that Liu Bei indeed sided with Yuan Shao, but Liu Bei did not expect Cao Cao to be marching his entire army out of ZHANG to attack him, because that would have left his capital open to attack by Yuan Shao. So there was no preparation. So when Cao Cao showed up in Xuzhou, Liu Bei was caught by surprise. Historical records indicate that Liu Bei actually went out scouting. Once there were news of an army approaching with around 10 men, they ran into Cao Cao's marching army. And when Liu Bei saw that it was Cao Cao's army, he immediately fled, and they basically abandoned Xuzhou, and Liu Bei left, headed toward Yuan Shao by himself. Now, for everyone behind, including his wives, Liu Bei's brothers, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei, they were pretty much abandoned to defend for themselves, and Liu Bei's wife were captured first. Guan Yu wasn't guarding Liu Bei's wife. That would make no sense to have Liu Bei kept his wife away from himself in a different city. Historical records doesn't really indicate what happened to Zhang Fei, other than the fact that he went off during this period where Liu Bei was with Yuan Shao and Guan Yu was at Cao Cao. He probably stayed around. He probably did run away after the battles of taking over the city. And historical record only indicates that Zhang Fei actually went to a town and met up with a girl, and they actually got married during this period. So he probably went back to join Liu Bei at the end, similar to Guan Yu. Once news of Liu Bei reappearing was confirmed, he left wherever he was, took a new wife, and went to go meet up with Liu Bei. As for Guan Yu, he was indeed in charge of defending Xiapei, which was the farthest city from Cao Cao's forces. So once Cao Cao arrived at Xiapei, there was probably a fight, and historical records vary on the account of whether he surrendered to Cao Cao or he was captured alive. Either way, there was really no discussion on the battlefield. He was just basically captured. And Cao Cao actually did admire Guan Yu. So he definitely kept him alive, gave him a promotion, tried to keep him on his side. So that is how Guan Yu actually joined Cao Cao. Now, after Guan Yu joined Cao Cao and returned with him back to Xuchang, he probably wasn't wined and dined so frequently like we said in the story. If you remember, it was a small banquet every 3 days, a big feast every 5 days. But Guan Yu was treated very, very well. He did get promotions. He did get gifts. He definitely wasn't in charge of guarding Liu Bei's wives, though. That was not his responsibility. Liu Bei's wife were captured, like we said, before Guan Yu was captured. They were probably treated with respect, kind of like hostages, because Liu Bei was still alive. So Cao Cao probably treated them like he would with any hostage members of the enemy general, perhaps. And they were basically kept in the city, probably planned to use them as either bargaining chip. And eventually they were planned to return to Liu Bei, because historically, Cao Cao and Liu Bei's relationship weren't that bad at this point. Now, it wasn't very long ago when Liu Bei actually served with Cao Cao in the capital, and that the two of them campaigned against Lü Bu. So it wasn't like Cao Cao captured the wife and were going to plan to torture them or anything. They were treated okay, and Guan Yu didn't have to worry about them. Now, Guan Yu did get showered a lot of gifts, and he did feel guilty off of that. So the part of the story where Zhang Liao talks to Guan Yu about, okay, what do you plan to do? What your goals are here? Are you going to leave Cao Cao eventually? And Guan Yu saying that, yes, I will leave Cao Cao eventually, but because of all the kindness he was shown, he wants to repay Cao Cao first before leaving. That conversation was historically accurate, or at least historically recorded. So we know that Guan Yu was treated well once he joined Cao Cao, and that he wanted to repay Cao Cao on the battlefield or as a general before making his return to Liu Bei. Now, the highlight of the beginning of our story is the part where Guan Yu helps out Cao Cao in the battles against Yuan Shao, when Yuan Shao sent Yan Liang to Bai Ma and eventually Wen Chou afterward. And you have the historical moment where Guan Yu kills Yan Liang and Wen Chou in a few moves, which really helped to build Guan Yu's reputation as the god of war. Now, did this really happen? So the part that is actually true is that Yan Liang did come out as the vanguard force and arrive in Bai Ma with 100,000 men. And Cao Cao did respond by going out there himself. And when they met, Cao Cao actually sent out Guan Yu and Zhang Liao right away. Guan Yu did go with Cao Cao the whole way. It wasn't like Cao Cao kept him in the back. And Guan Yu and Zhang Liao headed out, and they marched forth as vanguard units. Guan Yu did look into the enemy army, identify where Yan Liang was, and he did charge in, cut through the enemy army like hot knife through butter, went all the way to Yan Liang, basically hit him off his horse with his blade, then jumped out, cut his head off, rolled right back out. No one was able to stop him. That part is factual. And that part alone gave Guan Yu the reputation of God of War, pretty much all set right there. Because if you think about it, there was really no dueling like a lot of the story romanticizes. When armies meet, they would just fight each other on the battlefield like you would imagine. It'd be chaotic. And for Guan Yu to be able to ride into that chaos, head straight for the enemy general, not only knock him off his horse and win the battle, but also to behead him on the battlefield and be able to ride out and return with that head, that was an impressive feat. And Guan Yu was properly ranked up to Marquis after that victory. But the following victory over Wen Chou had nothing to do with Guan Yu historically. That fight was basically defined by Cao Cao's army being in a bad situation and making something good out of it. The situation was they just finished off with Yan Liang's army. They were still in Bai Ma. And they had all their supplies scattered along the road as they were trying to settle in. And Wen Chou's army came at this time. So the supplies were already scattered. So they were trying to make, this was a bad situation, obviously, because you have all your supplies on the road and the enemy's coming. You can't really gather everything up and run. So the strategy was we leave it as bait. And that was the actual strategy used. And Wen Chou's army did fall for the trap, and they started seizing all this military supply, and they weren't focused on the battle. And Cao Cao was able to use a much smaller force. I think historically it was recorded that Wen Chou had about 6,000 men with him by the end when they were gathering up supplies. And Cao Cao just sent out Xu Huang to charge out with 600 men, and that group was able to kill Wen Chou in the heat of the battle. It wasn't like a general duel. It was just like the cavalry came in, and Wen Chou died during that fight when most of his men were gathering up supplies. So the strategy part was real and factual. Guan Yu just didn't participate in it at all. Now, with the victories here, Cao Cao did put Yuan Shao back a bit, and Yuan Shao took a pause in the war, so Guan Yu and Cao Cao did go back to the capital. And the victory of killing Yan Liang, getting ranked up to Marquis, made Guan Yu feel comfortable that he has done enough for Cao Cao that he could leave. So Guan Yu did take his leave afterwards at this point. It wasn't really based on whether Liu Bei was at Yuan Shao's place or not. We'll get into that a bit later. But the thing here I want to talk about is that the name Zhang Liao comes up a lot in our lore series. It's portrayed that he and Guan Yu shared an old bond, and Guan Yu kind of bailed him out at Baimenlo when Zhang Liao was captured alongside Lu Bu. But historically speaking, the two of them really doesn't have much bond. The Baimenlo scene was also kind of made up in the story. Zhang Liao was spared after Lu Bu was captured, simply because Zhang Liao actually wasn't at Baimenlo when that scene happened. He was coming with a reinforcement army, and by the time he arrived, Lu Bu was already dead, and he simply surrendered. and there was no point to kill him at that point because he, surrendering with a whole army basically. But Guan Yu and Zhang Liao did build up a relationship when Guan Yu was serving Cao Cao, and Cao Cao relied on Zhang Liao to approach Guan Yu multiple times. And the reason for that is Guan Yu and Zhang Liao were from the same area of China. Their hometown was in Shanxi. So basically they were what we call in Chinese 老乡. They're people with similar background, similar dialect, similar food preferences. So they were better able to relate to each other. And they did build up a small friendship when Guan Yu was serving under Cao Cao. So that part is true, but it wasn't based on some past experience. Guan Yu didn't actually speak out and help out Zhang Liao at Baimenlou. That part was made up. All right, now let's get back to how Guan Yu actually left Cao Cao. That part is actually pretty accurate if you take out Liu Bei's wife. Guan Yu basically didn't take his gifts from Cao Cao, left them, wrote Cao Cao a letter, and did ask for permission to leave. And Cao Cao didn't make it very difficult. He wasn't trying to avoid Guan Yu whatsoever. He also didn't chase out and give him a robe. That was all added in by the author of the novel. But Guan Yu did approach Cao Cao and says, I did this for you, and I want to go back to Liu Bei. And Cao Cao respected that. Cao Cao really admired Guan Yu's loyalty and character, as well as his prowess on the battlefield. So Cao Cao actually granted Guan Yu that right to go back. So Guan Yu was allowed to leave. Our major historical deviation here, however, is the route that Guan Yu took after leaving. So the story here highlights or climaxes with Guan Yu crossing over 5 passes and killing 6 generals, or as it's known in Chinese as 过五关斩六将. However, if we look at the map here, the author names all 5 locations that he passes through. The first one, Dongling Guan, was kind of historically unknown. It's a small place, so it could be anywhere. But Luoyang, Sishui Guan, Xingyang, and Huanghe Dukou, those 4 locations are historically known, and we can locate them on the map today. And they're highlighted here. And if you notice, the river on the map is the Yellow River. Everything north of that is Yuan Shao's territory. So Guan Yu somehow headed out of the capital, went for the old capital Luoyang, which had a crossing, right? It's already bordering the river. So he took a western route first, even though he should be headed northeast, according to the novel. So he hit Luoyang, saw the river, didn't cross it, realized he was too far west, and then headed east and went through multiple passes and had multiple chances to cross the river. And it basically set him up to the place where he had to face off with Xia Houdun's garrison army at the Yellow River crossing before going over. And then what's more ridiculous is that once he was over, he had to go back farther south to Runan to meet up with Liu Bei. Now, the reason for this is not that Guan Yu didn't have a map or he was terrible with directions. It was because this route was made up by the author. The author made up this route completely. Guan Yu didn't have to go this route and probably never went this route. And this route was made famous in the Tang Dynasty when they were operas and plays made about Guan Yu's adventures during the Three Kingdom era. And the reason why they picked this route is because the capital at the time during Tang Dynasty was Chang'an. It wasn't Xuchang during the time of Cao Cao. So the people who made the opera back then mistook the capital location that was discussed in history. So if we look at this new map here, we can see the capital city of the Tang Dynasty at the time, Chang'an, located farther west on the map. So they went from Chang'an through probably a small place called Dongling Guan somewhere along the way that was not historically located, and then took this path going east, these 4 different passes. And this path now makes a lot more sense. But historically, this path didn't exist, and since it was made up for opera, it was not historically accurate. Guan Yu never had to go through 5 passes and kill 6 generals. All 6 generals that he killed on the way are fictional characters. They never existed in history. The author made them up. But this story has been so ingrained in the Chinese culture by this book that a lot of people just accept this as historical fact. But in reality, it actually didn't happen like this. What actually happened was that Liu Bei was actually already south of Yuan Shao's territory when Guan Yu left Cao Cao. The part about Liu Pi and Gongdu was historically correct. Liu Bei did go south and start up this Yellow Turban movement in Runan that caused problem for Cao Cao. And that's how Guan Yu heard about Liu Bei being alive. So if you look at this map here, the triangle is kind of the story description of Guan Yu going west first, going across east through the river, crossing over, finding out Liu Bei is not there, and then head way down south to Runan. But really, the route that he took historically was that he just left the capital and went southeast and arrived probably in half a day. And he went by himself, so he had the red hair. So that trip took no time for him. And he met up with Liu Bei right away. No excitement. Maybe there were some generals along the way who didn't get the message and tried to stop him, and he might have killed a few peoples, but there's no way of knowing. And this part of the story is just completely fictional. Now, that might disappoint a lot of you guys because when I was a kid and reading this story, Guan Yu going through the 5 passes, killing the 6 generals, protecting Liu Bei's wife, those were highlights. But if you look at history, Guan Yu was just a man, and his only impressive feat here, which we can't downplay, Guan Yu killing Yanliang was a very, very impressive feat. It was very difficult to achieve that, and that feat alone was referenced many, many times in Chinese history afterward, of whenever a general is able to fight his way into an enemy army and take the head of the enemy general. This is not an easy feat. Guan Yu did it. That's what made him famous. And that's why the authors fluffed up all the other stories around it to support how godly Guan Yu was as a figure. Now, there was a lot of other small details in this story that we can go over real quick that didn't really belong in the main flow of our conversation so far. For example, when Liu Bei ran off to Yuan Shao, he didn't take Guan Yu or Zhang Fei with him, but at the time, Zhao Yun was ready with him, and Zhao Yun did go with him to Yuan Shao. Historically speaking, there was no Yellow Turban episode that was stealing Zhao Yun's horse and Zhao Yun killed them. That didn't happen. That part was made up. Zhao Yun was already part of Liu Bei's forces at Xuzhou following Gongsun Zan's death up north at the hand of Yuan Shao. Now, another thing was there was an episode where Guan Yu adopts Guan Ping as his oldest son. This is very debatable whether it's historical fact or not, but most people believe that Guan Ping was actually Guan Yu's firstborn son by blood and was not adopted here, and he was probably born later when Guan Yu took on a new wife. But I say it's debatable because Guan Ping's birthday, the birth year, is actually highly debated. Some say he was born way before this point, but that kind of makes no sense because we know Guan Ping died alongside Guan Yu in the year 220, and there were historical records saying he was born maybe in the year 176. That would have made him 44 at the time, and we know for a fact that Guan Yu didn't have a kid up till the year 198. So that part is why it confuses some historical record of saying whether he was adopted or whether he was a firstborn. What I believe most likely was the case, that he was just born later on, and by the time he died with Guan Yu, he was probably just in his early 20s. Outside of that, a lot of the story about Gucheng, that part was all made up. Basically, the end of the story was all made up. Liu Bei was basically in Runan with Gongdu doing a yellow turban thing. Guan Yu found out, went to join him. Zhang Fei also found out, went to join him. Zhao Yun was already there. The 4 of them reunited. They had a little bit of men, and to seek out a place to stay and build up their forces, they went out west and went to Liu Biao. And that was what happened probably. So that kind of goes over the whole story. We went over a lot of things that were false, and that's the case you have with these romanticized novels. The author warns you in the title. It's a romance of the Three Kingdoms. It's not a historical record of Three Kingdoms, but it makes for a very exciting story. So that's why I shared it. And this episode is just to clear up all those points for all you history buffs who want to know what actually happened. And that concludes this lore series. I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed it, please remember to subscribe. That really helps support the channel and encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. Probably take a week off, and then we'll kickstart our Trippy series, which will kind of pick off where this series ends. We're going to see Liu Bei's faction seeking out shelter in Liu Biao. And we're going to kick off that series starting off with Zhuge Liang joining Liu Bei. And that series is going to explain how the epic battle Trippy came to be and how the three kingdoms formed basically after that battle. And it'll be a very defining point in the history of three kingdoms. And I hope you guys come back and join us for that. So see y'all next time. Bye.